Demri Parrott and Layne Staley. Mark Lanigan knew both of them well. As a matter of fact, Mark was Layne Staley's best friend during the good and the bad. I'm going to share with you a few quotes from Mark regarding Demri and Layne. Now keep in mind, as mentioned, Mark was literally Layne Staley's best friend, and he chose to willingly publish these quotes I'm going to share. Unfortunately, given the fact it is a tragic love story, the tragedy does take precedence in any honest retelling. Before she passed away, Demri's mother actually reached out to me and said she appreciated the balanced approach I took to Demri's story. So with all that said, who exactly was Mark Lanigan and what was his relationship to Demri and Layne? Mark and his band Screaming Trees never got as big as Alice in Chains, but they were still an important grunge band, and Mark in particular was very close with both Layne and Kurt Cobain. With regards to Demri, Mark had multiple things to say about her in his book Sing Backwards and Weep. If you want an unfiltered view about the dark side of the grunge movement, this is worth checking out. The first Demri-related quote I want to share with you is how apparently Demri wanted to hook up with Mark, even though she was dating Layne. It's well documented that, unfortunately, both Demri and Layne cheated on each other various times. This exchange between Mark and Demri happened at some point in the late 80s. Quote, "For years, Layne had a passionate on and off relationship with a girl named Demri, a friend of my ex-girlfriend Anna. Their relationship was marked with dizzying highs and dark, depressing lows. She was said to be somewhat indiscriminate when it came to hooking up with people, much like myself. Who knows, I thought, before I really knew him, maybe it's an open relationship. But once Layne and I became friends, it became clear that Demri's behavior caused Layne some pain, even though they both cheated on each other. I had gotten a glimpse into her straightforward approach before I'd even met Layne. Ironically, in the same way that I met Layne, Demri and I encountered each other for the first time outside of a Seattle drug house. As I was leaving, she was going in. 'Hey there, aren't you Anna's boyfriend? I'm Demri.' I was instantly attracted to this sexy, smiling girl. The first thought that rolled through my head was, wow. She had this alluring outward sexuality, a beautiful face, and the most extraordinary eyes. 'Yeah, I am. Please don't tell her you saw me here, though. That would cause problems,' I said. I felt like such a jerk whenever I was compelled to ask a stranger to keep my secrets, but most addicts were keeping secrets from someone themselves. There was some semblance of a code of secrecy among certain junkies. 'No problem here, handsome. What are you doing right now?' she asked me with a coy smile. 'No plans, just heading home.' 'Well, why don't you come home with me? We can get high and have sex.' That came out of the blue. Demri's brazen, direct approach put me on heels for a second, but struck me like a kick to the balls. A shockingly pleasurable one. I don't think that would be a very good idea. Thanks, but I can't." Then she grabbed my hand and said, "Oh, come on, I'll never tell anyone. You're cute, I like you, nobody's at my place. Come on, you won't be sorry." I was sorely tempted, but I had a feeling I would somehow end up very sorry. Your private business could spread quickly through the small, incestuous Seattle music scene. Demri was beautiful. It was the type of situation I found nearly impossible to pass up. But Demri's connection to my girlfriend and to this guy Layne that I'd not met yet but already deeply respected as an artist made me think twice. For once, I was smart enough not to take the bait. With more than a little regret, I again declined Demri and walked home alone. But for a while afterward, it continued to play heavily on my mind." End quote. Now, heroin addiction, of course, was not uniquely a Layne and Demri issue. Seattle, in general, has had a heroin problem for a long time. At the end of this documentary, I'm going to share with you a few quotes from people who describe what the situation was like regarding heroin in the Seattle grunge scene in the 90s. But first, let's get back specifically to Layne and Demri. According to many people who knew Layne, including Mark Lanigan, Demri Parrott's death in 1996 basically killed Layne Staley emotionally and sent him on an even bigger downward spiral than he was already on. According to Mark, when he first spoke to Layne over the phone about Demri's death, Layne was in shambles. Unfortunately, Mark was on tour in Europe with the Screaming Trees and couldn't be there in Seattle to comfort Layne. Quote, "There was a knock on my hotel room door. I looked out the peephole and saw it was a friend on the other side. I unlocked the door and let him in. By the sad, beaten-down look on his face, I knew he had some bad news. 'Hey, Mark, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Demri passed away. Layne would like you to call him as soon as you can.' No, not again, I thought. This was going to destroy Layne. He had loved her so passionately that after their final breakup, one of many breakups in their tempestuous years-long on-again, off-again relationship, Layne had made a conscious decision to never date another woman. If not with Demri, he preferred to be alone. My heart was broken for him. I called him and left a message with my room number and the phone number to the hotel, and he called right back. The first thing he said to me was, "Oh man, I can't believe it, she's gone." Then he broke down in tears. I reacted, "I'm so sorry, brother. I am so sorry. I don't know what to say. I'm just incredibly sorry this happened to you." Even though I'd had plenty of experience with loss, I was still a piss-poor comfort to those in pain. I had never developed the necessary skills to verbally express any real words of wisdom to help anyone in that way. My first public response to death of a friend was stoicism. Privately, I might cry like a baby. Through his tears, Layne said, "I can't stand to be alone right now. When are you coming back?" "I just got here today, Layne. We're not back for 6 weeks. "Crap," he said. "I wish you were coming back sooner. I need to hang out with someone. This is tearing me up." "I'm sorry, bro. Look, my friend Simon is at my place. Go stay there. I need someone to keep an eye on him anyways. Kick him out of their bedroom and you take it. He can sleep on the couch or the mattress. You be doing me a favor, man." Layne had been around Simon, and I knew he could tolerate him. Simon's generally quiet nature made him easy to be around, and I trusted him. "Okay, I'm going over there," Layne said quickly. "Just let me know when. I should call Simon and give him a heads up," I responded. "Right now," Layne said. I quickly did the math. 2:30 in the afternoon in Paris meant it was 5:30 a.m. in Seattle. Demri's mother lived just a block from my apartment. I wondered if Layne might drop in there to offer his condolences or get a tiny sip of relief in sharing their shared pain of loss, even though they'd had a bit of a strained relationship. Upon returning to Seattle after my horrific tour of Europe, the first thing Layne said to me when he saw me was, "Whoa, man, what the hell happened to you?" "Let's just say it was a rough ride," I said, and left it at that. I was relieved to have reliable sources of heroin at my disposal once more, and the three of us stayed awake for days on end in my apartment, alternatively hitting the pipe with Simon obsessively scanning the floor looking for what we might have dropped. Eventually, Simon, like so many other addicts I've crossed paths with, went for a walk one day and simply never came back. Now it was just me and Layne. Layne spent a few more months in squalor with me in my small one-bedroom apartment. He never stopped grieving Demri's death. After a while, Layne's father, Phil, also an addict, took up Simon's dubious duties as our runner, which made for a weird dynamic. Finally, after almost 4 months, Layne began to crave isolation and moved back into his penthouse condo in the University District. End quote. Demri's death absolutely devastated Layne. She was by far the most important romantic relationship he ever had. His infamous self-imposed lockdown in his apartment during the latter stages of his life when Demri had passed away is well documented. But even before Demri died in '96, Layne was experiencing several dark episodes in that apartment. I'm going to share with you a couple of quotes now, first from Mark Lanigan and then from Johnny Bacolis, an old friend of Layne's who lived with him in the apartment. These quotes describe what Layne was like around the time of Mad Season. Mad Season was the supergroup Layne was a part of from '94 to '96, so these quotes take place in that time period. The first quote is from Mark Lanigan's book Sing Backwards and Weep, where he discusses a very sad episode of Layne where he was experiencing hallucinations in his apartment. Quote, "When I was not developing songs with my band Screaming Trees, I continued making and selling crack. Whenever I was not working, I was spending most of my free time smoking crack and shooting heroin around the clock, with Layne Staley in his apartment. He had a roommate for a while, a really nice normal dude named Johnny, who I had at first suspected to be hired by someone to keep an eye on Layne. It became obvious after a while that Johnny was just a guy who cared for Layne, a friend and a non-drug user. Whenever we got loaded while he was at home, it was in the privacy of Layne's bedroom. Johnny seemed increasingly beat down by the futility and the darkness that began to pervade the place, less happy to see me and less lighthearted every time I'd stop by. Johnny moved out after 6 or 7 months. Unsupervised, the pair of us sank deeper into the crap. Layne called one night and frantically asked me to come over right away. When I got there, I did our secret personal sequence of knocks on the door and heard him shout from down the hall, "Come in!" That in itself shocked me because he would never leave the door unlocked. I came in, locked the door, and cautiously called his name. "Down here, man, in the bathroom." "Why was the door unlocked, bro?" I asked while approaching the toilet. So I can get out of here in a hurry if I have to, Layne hissed. I entered the bathroom to the strange sight of him lying on his stomach on the floor, his head behind the bathroom toilet, staring intently at a tiny hole in the wall. What's going on, brother? Why would you have to get out of here? I quietly asked, not sure if I really wanted to know the answer. Quiet, man. They're back here. Wait a minute and be quiet. They'll come out again, he forcefully whispered. Who are they? I whispered back. The spiders, man. I was asleep when I woke up and they were coming out of my arm. I had known some truly mentally ill people in my life. I'd spent Christmas Eve in a psych ward with my childhood friend who had been in and out of the mental hospital for years with paranoid schizophrenia. And so with Layne and the spiders, I didn't like the look of this or sound of it at all. Hey, Layne, why don't you get up off the floor and let's go sit on the couch for a minute and talk? Shh, quiet, man. They can hear you. My goodness, I thought. He's lost it. I stood there racking my brain as to what my next steps should be. Whatever they were, they would have to be done with utmost care. I thought about calling Jerry Cantrell, but quickly changed my mind. The Alice guys, Jerry, Sean Kinney, and the bass player Mike Inez, along with producer Toby Wright, had recently enlisted me to try to get Layne out of his apartment and down to a recording studio. They wanted to start making music. Layne would begin by saying, "Tell them I'll be there by 9," and I would relay the message. 9 would turn into 11:30, then 2 a.m., and finally I asked again if he would simply reject the idea out of hand, completely and with a total finality. This routine had gone on for a few days. They would probably be as helpless or more than me in this situation. At least I had a tiny bit of sway with Layne. Layne, man, listen to me. I don't see any spiders back there. Just get up for a minute and let's go talk quietly in the living room. After several long moments of silence, he suddenly slid backwards on his stomach from behind the toilet bowl, got to his feet, and grabbed me by the arm, leading me into the other room. Lifting his sleeve, he showed me an ugly mark on his arm. I caught them crawling out of there and saw one peeking out the hole behind the toilet. I have to kill them before they take the whole place over, he said in a choked and extremely quiet voice. He went to put a rock in his crack pipe, a glass tube with cigarette lighter blackened steel wool, stuffed into the end. Hold on a sec, bro, I said. Let's not hit the pipe right now. We need to talk about this rationally. It was pure crack craziness that I was witnessing, a frightening level of psychosis. He was convinced there were spiders coming out of his arms, hiding behind his toilet, and taking over his house. I coaxed him to do a shot of dope instead, in hopes it would even out his mind. Then I talked to him into coming over to my place with me, promising I would hire exterminators to go in and clean his place out if he wished. I was pained beyond words to see him in this way, the sweetest, funniest, most magical and intelligent dude I knew out of his tree. Such was my love for the guy. He had become like the half of me I always lacked. After a couple of days, he was back to normal, but occasionally he'd say something that made it clear these imaginary spiders were still somewhere in the back of his mind. I kept him at my house for a week until one day he looked at me and said, "I lost my mind, didn't I?" I looked at him and the familiar mischievous twinkle normally in his eyes was back. I started laughing. Thank goodness you realized that. I was afraid we were going to have to hit the nut house. I'm sorry, man, he smiled. Man, that was weird. Yeah, it was, but you ain't got nothing to be worried about, brother. I'm just glad you're back, I said to him with great relief. End quote. Unfortunately, as we've been discussing, drugs were very prevalent in the 90s Seattle music scene. Many people, not just Layne, struggled with addiction. I'm going to share with you now another quote from Mark Lanigan's book, Sing Backwards and Weep, involving Demri Parrott and also Mike Starr. Mike Starr was the bassist in Alice in Chains until 1993. This story takes place at Mark Lanigan's Seattle apartment in 1995. Quote, I got buzzed by someone at the front door. To my unhappy surprise, there was Demri, dressed in a white hospital gown, wheeling a pole with an IV bottle at my front door in broad daylight. I was pissed beyond words. What the heck, Demri? What happened to you? She lowered her gown and showed me the ugly red vertical scar running down the middle of her chest. I got an illness, and they gave me a pacemaker. She smiled, as if she were telling me she won the lottery. Mark, do you have any dope? I'll even take cottons, whatever. Are you kidding me? No way, get yourself back to the hospital, you're out of your mind, I told her. The illness she had was endocarditis, a dreaded illness an IV drug user could catch from the bacteria in heroin. It destroyed your heart valves and was often deadly. That she contracted the infection, had to have a pacemaker installed, and still wheeled herself over here to try to get high, blew my mind. The unforgiving power of her addiction was shocking. I callously shut the door on her mid-sentence during her plea for drugs, turned around, walked back upstairs to my apartment, and turned off the buzzer. Like my first meeting with Demri at the dope house, I kept this episode to myself, not wanting to cause Layne any more heartbreak than he'd already taken. Around the same time, Mike Starr also buzzed me one night. Surprised to see him, I opened the door and let him in. He was the ex-bass player for Alice in Chains. I hadn't seen him in years. "What the heck, Mike? How you been?" Mike replied, "Man, I just got busted but made bail. I'm dope sick as hell. Are you holding anything?" I had not known Mike as a junkie during the time we spent together touring. As far as I was concerned, he was just a strange cat like the trailer park hoodlums I'd grown up with. Not super intelligent, but with a dubious gift for getting over on people. "Sorry to hear that, bro. Come up to my place," I told him. Once inside my apartment, I saw that despite the cold weather, he was dressed in only a white t-shirt and a pair of white boxer shorts. No shoes, nothing. "Sorry, Mike, I don't have any dope. Just a little crack for sale if you're interested." I lied about the dope, since I could plainly see he wasn't holding a wallet or any dough. Crack was something I could share a tiny bit of if he were so inclined. "Aw, crap, what am I gonna do?" He was talking to himself, not me. "Mark, can I use your phone?" "Sure, Mike, go ahead." He got on the phone and went around the corner into my kitchen for some privacy, but in his agitated state, he did not notice me standing right outside the door listening. "No, he doesn't have any," he muttered emphatically to whoever was on the other line. "He's got crack, that's all I know. No, I don't know if he's got cash up here." Someone had either coerced Mike into trying to burn me, or he was just a scout for whoever came next. He hung up the phone. "Hey Mike, sorry I couldn't help you out, but I gotta go somewhere, so you gotta split." Then he asked me, "Hey, can I catch a ride with you?" "Sorry man, I'm not riding. I'll see you later, Mike." I opened my infrequently used kitchen door and gently shoved him out, locking the door behind him. For the next 10 minutes or so, he continued knocking intermittently, saying quietly, "Hey Mark, hey bro, can I come back in?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I sat on my couch with a gun. The loaded stolen Desert Eagle 44 Magnum pistol I had traded $50 worth of crack for, just in case there was going to be more to this scene with Mike than met the eye. Eventually, I heard him sigh heavily and the hallway floor creaking as he walked barefoot softly away down the corridor and to the stairs. I would not see him again for several more years. End quote. In an interview for Rolling Stone, journalist Corey Groh asked Mark Lanigan the following question, quote, "Shortly after your rehab, you wrote that you learned about Layne Staley's death, and that's where the book ends. Since you were clean then, was it harder for you to process his death?" End quote. The following is from Mark Lanigan. This was his response. This article for Rolling Stone was published on April 23, 2020. Quote, "Out of my friends, I was the guy who they always thought would never have a chance of getting clean because I was so maniacal in my approach. I would have climbed Mount Everest for drugs. I was always trying to kick. Layne Staley was a magical person who was also hell-bent on doing drugs until he died. The first time I saw him after I'd gotten clean, I'd been clean a year. I'm pretty sure that Jerry Cantrell and Mike Inez flew me up to Seattle because they were unable to get into his house. He had a camera and lived in the penthouse of this condo. So whenever anybody from that camp would come to see him, he would just ignore it. Jerry and Mike knew that when he saw me, he would let me in. I went along with that. And I also wanted him to see that I was clean, that it was possible to get clean, that his prediction that I would never be able to do it had failed. Hopefully, maybe it would give him the idea that he himself could do it too. But he didn't want to do it. When I got there, I said, "Hey man, it's been a while. I've been clean for more than 12 months. And he was like, "No, you weren't, man. You just left like 2 months ago." His sense of time had warped, and he wasn't buying the truth from me. I remember him saying at that point, "I always just keep thinking I'm going to get that same feeling I got the first time again." And dude, I never got that first feeling again after the first time I ever did dope. I immediately had to do 5 times more to even get close to it. So for me, that was an impossibility, but that was his obsession. It's heartbreaking the way he went. I always knew that that's what was going to happen. Although I had always hoped that there would be some medical emergency that would put him in the hospital and give him a moment away from the routine of crack and heroin that might give him a break and some insight. That medical emergency ended up being his death. I still love listening to Alice in Chains. When they come on the radio, it makes me feel good. But if Nirvana comes on the radio, it throws me into a depression. Like, if I'm in an Uber, you have to turn that off. And I think it's because of my own actions in the deaths of both these guys who I loved equally. Of course, I was not a great influence on Layne, but drugs were a mutual thing. I put it like this. Kurt was like a little brother. Layne was like a twin. End quote. In terms of Kurt Cobain's death, Mark Lanigan has said he has deep regrets because apparently he didn't pick up Kurt's calls the day he died. I'll be exploring that and much more in detail here. They had a very interesting relationship. If you want to hear more about Demri and Layne, I did put together an almost 2-hour documentary about them. That documentary is linked in the description box, and it's also going to be the end screen at the end of the video if you want to stick around for that. Now, in terms of Kurt and Mark, in an interview for Rolling Stone, journalist Corey Groh asked Mark Lanigan the following question. Quote, "You wrote that you have a deep regret for your actions around his death because he'd called you that day and you didn't return his calls. How did you process his death?" The following is Mark Lanigan's response. This article for Rolling Stone was published on April 23, 2020. Quote, "When a drug addict loses a friend, they just do more drugs. I moved forward by sticking with the people that I knew, Dylan Carlson and my best friend in Seattle, Layne Staley, and we continued to do what we always did. But now we were missing a huge piece of our lives. Logic would tell you that when a friend of yours dies the way that Cobain did, it would make you wise up and say, oh crap, man, do I want to end up like this too? But instead, what a drug addict does is they just do more drugs and cry in their beer. Kurt's death just made me go deeper and deeper, just wanting to disappear and forget that I had what started as this really pure relationship of mutual admiration with Kurt for each other's music, which we had for years. We liked the same kind of music, and then that warped into a situation where he had become so famous that he said to me at one point, "You and Dylan are the only real friends I have anymore," at the height of his popularity. And it was really just sad. I also remember thinking, what kind of friend am I? Because this guy used to look up to me. And he always acted as though he did look up to me still, even though I knew he saw my decline. I just remember thinking, wow, I could have shown some decent guidance here to help this kid who looked up to me and who I loved. And instead, I was just a guy who became one of those people that would go out and buy drugs for his more famous friends who couldn't go out in public. That was hard to reconcile, and it always will be. I could have been a different person, but I wasn't. Kurt and I were really close before he became famous. Funny enough, I was actually the famous one in our relationship for a number of years. He had a natural talent. I knew that from the moment I saw him singing in the Ellensburg Public Library, in a tiny town I grew up in. Dylan Carlson had asked me to go see his friend Kurt's band play there because Kurt was a fan of mine. And that's how I met Kurt, as a fan of mine. He looked up to me sort of like a big brother, but I knew this guy had something magical. It took a while, but obviously the world recognized his talent at some point, and we all know what happened with that. End quote. Mark Lanigan and Nirvana have shared history with one another, particularly the Jury Project in 1989, where Mark Lanigan and Mark Pickerel of the Screaming Trees recorded 4 songs together with Kurt and Chris, most notably a rendition of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, which was released on Mark Lanigan's debut solo record in 1990, The Winding Sheet. The Jury sessions took place in August of 1989. A few months earlier, on April 14th, 89, Nirvana played a show in Mark Lanigan's hometown of Ellensburg, Washington, a small city about 2 hours southeast of Seattle. The show made a big impression on Mark Lanigan, who once recalled the following, quote, "In the spring of 89, Nirvana played a show at the community center in my hometown of Ellensburg, Washington. They completely blew me away. It was like seeing The Who in their prime. After 2 songs, some guy who worked there stopped the show. Nirvana had gone over their time limit because the local bands who had opened had gone over time. So they just stood there for a second, and then Chris started throwing his bass in the air, up to the top of this 20-foot ceiling and catching it with one hand. Meanwhile, Kurt was letting his amp go as loud as heck, and their road manager got into a fist fight with the guy who stopped the show. The whole thing was completely crazed, And this was in Ellensburg of all places. I still believe to this day, Nirvana's the best band I've ever seen. End quote. Mark Lanigan and Kurt Cobain are of course two of the marquee figures of the grunge scene, and according to Mark Pickerel, the two of them had a mutual respect for one another. The following is a quote from Mark Pickerel. Quote, I know that Kurt was a big fan of Lanigan's. They traded a lot of tapes and had conversations about different artists they liked. Apparently, I don't know if Mark turned Kurt onto Leadbelly or if Kurt was already a fan, but at some point, Mark approached me about playing drums on a project that he and Kurt wanted to start, which would really focus on blues, particularly Leadbelly's catalog. I believe we were also talking about playing songs by all the great bluesmen. I got really excited about it and was envisioning this supergroup that was bound for success, sort of to be the modern-day Northwest version of Cream. It was funny because, having been in a band with Mark for so long, his personality in the Screaming Trees was he couldn't help but be really the band leader. He is just a natural leader, is very outspoken, and can be very aggressive. The couple of rehearsals we had, I saw a different side of Mark, one that was much quieter. He seemed to have a great deal of respect for Kurt and Chris. At the same time, Kurt seemed intimidated by Lanigan's talents and vision. End quote. As mentioned earlier in the first Mark Lanigan quote that I read, according to Mark Lanigan himself, Mark's best friend was Layne Staley of Alice in Chains. The following is a quote where Mark Lanigan talks about the death of Layne Staley and how he compares Layne Staley and Kurt Cobain to one another, how their two deaths affected him differently. Quote, out of my friends, I was the guy who they always thought would never have a chance of getting clean because I was so maniacal in my approach. I would have climbed Mount Everest for drugs. I was always trying to kick. Layne Staley was a magical person who was also hell-bent on doing drugs until he died. The first time I saw him after I'd gotten clean, I'd been clean a year. I'm pretty sure that Jerry Cantrell and Mike Inez flew me up to Seattle because they were unable to get into his house. He had a camera and lived in the penthouse of this condo. So whenever anybody from that camp would come to see him, he would just ignore it. Jerry and Mike knew that when he saw me, he would let me in. I went along with that. And I also wanted him to see that I was clean, that it was possible to get clean, that his prediction that I would never be able to do it had failed. Hopefully, maybe it would give him the idea that he himself could do it too. But he didn't want to do it. When I got there, I said, hey man, it's been a while. I've been clean for more than 12 months. And he was like, no you weren't, man. You just left like 2 months ago. His sense of time had warped, and he wasn't buying the truth from me. I remember him saying at that point, I always just keep thinking I'm going to get that same feeling I got the first time again. And dude, I never got that first feeling again after the first time I ever did dope. I immediately had to do 5 times more to even get close to it. So for me, that was an impossibility, but that was his obsession. It's heartbreaking the way he went. I always knew that that's what was going to happen. Although I had always hoped that there would be some medical emergency that would put him in the hospital and give him a moment away from the routine of crack and heroin that might give him a break and some insight. That medical emergency ended up being his death. I still love listening to Alice in Chains. When they come on the radio, it makes me feel good. But if Nirvana comes on the radio, it throws me into a depression. Like, if I'm in an Uber, you have to turn that off. And I think it's because of my own actions in the deaths of both these guys who I loved equally. Of course, I was not a great influence on Layne, but drugs were a mutual thing. I put it like this. Kurt was like a little brother. Layne was like a twin. End quote. Now, of course, when it comes to Kurt Cobain and Mark Lanigan, and in a broader sense, Nirvana and the Screaming Trees, there are multiple connections between the two bands. One of those connections is producer Steve Fisk, who worked with both Nirvana and the Screaming Trees. I've done a couple of interviews with Steve over the years. The first one was about Nirvana, and the second was about the Trees. I want to show you a clip now from my interview with Steve about the Screaming Trees, where he touches on Mark Lanigan. Later in this video, I'll be exploring more details about Mark Lanigan's relationship with Kurt Cobain, including a quote from Screaming Trees drummer Mark Pickerel, where, according to Mark, Kurt Cobain was actually intimidated by Mark Lanigan, at least initially. I'll be exploring that and more later on. But first, the Steve Fisk clip. If you want to see the full interview with Steve, the link is available below. So what was it like working with Mark Lanigan as a vocalist?
Well, I think the longer he sang, the more he figured out what he could do with that bass register, a low tenor thing. That's kind of his signature now.
Did you ever double his voice?
A lot of the time, yeah. He chewed tobacco.
As he was singing?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And it was always hard to make his voice read against all those guitar overdubs. Mark learned the hard way that if you leave Lee on his own, he'll just do guitar overdubs. By the time we got to mixing the Invisible Lantern record, Mark was like, what? Like, no. You know?
That's funny.
He was at home in his low octave, which hadn't really blossomed yet. Mark Lanigan, as we know him now, you can start to hear, that thing kind of jump out where the screams all land, And when he goes for a big note, he's got the right lyric and the right turn and the right push behind it. There was a couple of moments where I went like, oh shit, he's really turning into something really wonderful, and he was always good and he was always lyric and melodic. If he wasn't happy, then the whole vibe got just, then there was no vibe and you were just trying to make Mark happy. But Mark was also in a lot of physical pain. And he had really bad headaches and he was totally sober the whole time, it's none of my fucking business. But, when you're making a complete, commitment to doing psychedelic records, I was the only guy that smoked pot. Nobody smoked pot. A couple of guys in the band drank a little bit, but, Mark was serious about doing it. I mean, and we went through a kind of a sound search on his voice and played with different kinds of compression and turning off compression. So no, there was a whole very concerted effort. We started with this Neumann, because it was the best, that KM84 I was telling you about earlier. I think that's the vocal mic on Other Worlds and Clairvoyance, and eventually we switched over to an SM58, which is kind of a pedestrian microphone, but it's a great microphone to scream into. I know you've had a whole video about Kurt Cobain screaming in microphones and all of that. But, Mudhoney, we're using SM58s. Everybody's using SM58s, so we just quit fucking around with trying to do something high quality or fancy and just use an SM58. So, yeah, Invisible Lantern and even if and especially when we're just, Mark singing into a mic on a stand. One of the other things you got to think about, too, is when you have an 8-track, that means at a certain point you have to erase the scratch vocal. There's no way to save the scratch vocal. And even though the sound was shitty and there was tons of bleed, Mark Lanigan's scratch vocals were so good. And I would try to talk him out of it, but there wasn't like any fancy digital thing where you could bounce it off someplace with the idea that eventually you'd figure out some way to use it or something like that. And it didn't sound like a real vocal because it had guitars and cymbals and everything in it. But Mark Lanigan's scratch vocals, he delivered on every fucking take. There wasn't a scratch vocal that wasn't as good as it could get. As somebody who later really learned how to recognize a good take, the idea that there aren't any live Mark Lanigan takes from that whole period of our work with him, I'm just embarrassed. That's just stupid. But that's just the reality of it. And then it's also, that's working with an artist and understanding is like, there's no way I'm putting that vocal out,
I hear you. So I mean,
erase it,
So would he be the kind of person that he would sing like 15-20 minutes, take a break and come back, or would he be one of the guys that would go for like 2 hours straight? Like what was he like in that regard?
I think we had evenings where we just sang vocals, 4 hours of singing, 3 hours of singing. It was just like at a certain point there was just sort of a workman thing. We're like, all right, we've done all the guitars, let's do all the vocals. I didn't know anything about different kinds of singers. I hadn't learned so I learned a lot about recording vocals working with Lanigan, and I think we tried all kinds of things. Remember there was one song, I forgot which one it was, I'm pretty sure it was an Invisible Lantern song where Mark didn't want to finish it or didn't want to finish writing the words or something. Forget what the thing was, and he made like a whole party out of it where it says, okay, Rod Doak, the sound like, you go sing it now. Okay, Lee, you sing it now. And Lee would go out and do his version of it, and we make a mix of that. And it says, okay, Fisk, you go out and sing it now. So there's this one song that's got And there's this cassette of it somewhere. Maybe it's gone by now, but it's just me doing all these rough mixes of like these, and everybody in the studio sang the song because Mark was just having fun, kind of not finishing the vocal.
That's funny.
You know?
So in general, like how many takes would you get for his vocals? Like would you do a lot of takes or just not that many?
It seemed to go well. He was never like, hey, I just nailed that. You know, he's not that kind of guy. So even when it was great, he still had all kinds of misgivings, but he could walk away from it going, that's as good as it's going to get tonight. Neither of us knew what we were doing. You know, we figured out in SM58, and I think there was an old Symmetrix 522 compressor. He just did a great job of figuring out his shit. And it was by, you know, a lot of learn by, you know, by doing kind of thing, you know. So he, a lot of shit was good enough, but, you know, for him, you know, he's got a kind of a relentless thing about perfection and all of that. So I think that drove him to, you know, do all this other, you know, God, it's really inaccurate, really, really badly worded. But, you know, what he turned into was because he wasn't happy with what he was. And without getting into the book, but the idea that he was saddled with doing this kind of genre music, you know, the psychedelic thing, you know, it's like he loved it, he dug it, but like all the Screaming Trees, he listened to tons of music. So the idea that he doesn't want to talk about, you know, the old stuff or play the old songs or anything like that, I mean, that makes complete sense. You know, it was where he landed, it's how he got started, but, you know, I don't think it was his first love.
Yeah, fair enough.
And in a small town, you know, there's not another band, you know, so I think, you know, he loved all these guys, but, you know, wasn't necessarily, you know, a good fit from the beginning, you know. And then you go to Seattle, and then you're in the goddamn 90s, you know, and you're from Eastern Washington, so you're not part of, you know, the UW hipster thing or the North End metal thing or any of this shit. So they're outsiders in the middle of this thing that's incredibly political and high pressure and weird, and surprised they got to be friends with Nirvana. Also the Hicks from the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
You know?
Maybe that's why they connected, you know?
Yeah.
The following is from Screaming Trees drummer Mark Pickerel, where he discusses Kurt Cobain's admiration for Screaming Trees singer Mark Lanigan. Quote, "They traded a lot of tapes and had conversations about different artists they liked. Apparently, I don't know if Mark turned Kurt onto Leadbelly or if Kurt was already a fan, but at some point, Mark approached me about playing drums for a project that he and Kurt wanted to start, which would really focus on blues, particularly Leadbelly's catalog. I believe we were also talking about playing songs by all the great bluesmen. I got really excited about it and was envisioning this supergroup that was bound for success, sort of the modern-day Northwest version of Cream. It was funny because, having been in a band with Mark for so long, his personality in the Screaming Trees was he couldn't help but really be the band leader. He just is a natural leader, is very outspoken, and can be very aggressive. The couple of rehearsals we had, I saw a different side of Mark, one that was much quieter. He seemed to have a great deal of respect for Kurt and Chris. At the same time, Kurt seemed intimidated by Lanigan's talents and vision." End quote. This supergroup that Mark Pickerel is referring to, of course, would be known as the Jury. On August 20th and 28th, 1989, the band recorded 4 tracks with producer Jack Endino, including a version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Later in this video, I'm going to show you a clip from one of my interviews with Jack Endino where he reflects on this, but first I'm going to share with you a quote from Mark Pickerel where he discusses how the project came together. Quote, "We were all becoming big blues fans during a similar point in time. I think Lanigan approached me with it because he knew that I was already a big Leadbelly fan, and just a blues fan in general. And since Kurt and Chris were both becoming fans of the same genre, we thought it'd be cool to be the first band out of the Northwest that already had some notoriety to try and forge ahead with a different sound, or a different vision. I believe we learned a version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night from a cassette that I had. I think Kurt brought a cassette version of Ain't It a Shame. Grey Goose may have been Lanigan. I think we started exclusively with Leadbelly, and then we were going to branch out from there. The original idea was just to do a session devoted to Leadbelly, and then go back in later on and do some other blues artists as well. Mark's vocals with Kurt's vocals could have led to something really powerful, I think, but the irony is, it was that combination of those two personalities that slowed things down. They were like junior high kids at a dance, a couple of wallflowers. I felt like I was the cheerleader of the entire session, always making suggestions and trying to get us to move in a certain direction. or to try a certain song, or even sometimes suggesting who might sing the song. Neither Mark or Kurt really wanted to take the initiative to make a lot of decisions. It's funny now that everyone's calling the project the jury, because no one else seemed to be all that excited about the idea at the time. Kurt really wanted to call it Lithium. It seemed as though Mark was satisfied with the name, but not necessarily excited about it. And I don't remember if Chris had an opinion one way or the other about it. But Kurt definitely did not want to call it the jury. And the funny thing is, I don't really care for that name anymore. But it's a little too late for that. Who knows what we might have done if we'd been able to get together once a year for a couple of weeks. Lanigan and I have massive record collections, so there would have been a wealth of music for us to listen to learn from, research, and recreate. I really regret that it didn't happen. End quote. Here's the Jack and Dino clip, guys. If you'd like to see the full interview with Jack and Dino, the link is available below. You know, when people think of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, they often think of the MTV Unplugged version. But you actually recorded, from what I understand, the original one that Mark Lanigan and Kurt Cobain did together. Is this correct?
Correct.
And what was the story there exactly?
I may get this wrong because nobody has asked me about this for a long time. At some point, there was a session where Mark Lanigan and Mark Pickrell, the drummer from the Screaming Trees, and Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic were going to come in and record a side project that they'd been doing where they supposedly were writing some songs together. Now, they booked the time, and then apparently they never wrote any songs together, or as Kurt said, well, we wrote some songs together, but we forgot them all. I don't know if it ever happened, actually. Mm-hmm. But he said, what we're going to do instead is we're just going to record some Lead Belly tunes. And I thought, okay. So they came in and recorded, and I think this is when that session took place. They recorded Where Did You Sleep Last Night? They recorded Ain't It a Shame, which is on the box set, and something called Grey Goose, which I had no memory of for years and years because it doesn't have a vocal. It's literally one riff over and over again. It's not very exciting, but there it was on the master tapes when we finally pulled it out. They just, for some reason, nobody bothered singing on it that day. And it ended up on the box set, I think. That was all they managed to do that day. One song with Mark singing, one song with Kurt singing, and an instrumental. And I asked them, what do I put on the log sheet? And they said, I'll call it the jury. So, okay. So, but it wasn't really a band. But it was the only time I got to record Mark Pickrell drumming with Chris and Kurt. And I think that is where that version of Where Do You Sleep Last Night came from. Because sometime after that, when I was recording Mark Lanigan's first solo record, I think the subject of that song came up and we decided to just put that on the end of it. That's why that song is on the winding sheet. There's another song on the winding sheet called Down in the Dark, where we got Kurt to come in and do a backing vocal, and I'm doing a little electric guitar on it as well. Probably the only thing on which I'm playing guitar with Kurt singing that exists, which is interesting. I haven't really thought about that. Yes, but that was the version, that arrangement of the song, I think, is what inspired Kurt to do the song at the Unplugged session much later.
Really?
Probably so. Although really, Kurt was present when we recorded the Mark Lanigan version, so, I'm sure they arranged it together. Anyway, this is all speculation.
So, for you, when you listen to, I guess, the Unplugged version, how does it compared to the versions that you were involved with? Like, what do you think of it?
The arrangement is the same. The difference really is the instrumentation and the vocal. He sings it very similar to how Mark Lanigan sings it, but, he puts the sort of Kurt passion into it, really.
Yeah.
Different players, different instrumentation. I think the only thing in common is, Kurt's playing acoustic on it,